Another mass shooting in the United States, 11 dead in a Pittsburgh synagogue. How worrying is the rise of right-wing extremism in America? Who's to blame? And does President Donald Trump's rhetoric fuel the hate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The number of reported hate crimes in the United States rose in 2016, the year Donald Trump was elected president. The second consecutive year, the figures have increased. African Americans, Jews and Muslims were all targeted. Last week, a Florida man was arrested after mail bombs were sent to some of Trump's high-profile critics. And on Saturday, 11 people were killed in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. Shihab Rattansi reports on the latest mass shooting.
A message of defiance and of the need to address the causes of right-wing extremist violence was heard at a multi-faith vigil in Pittsburgh early Sunday evening.
We will recognize this moment as a moment when this nation needs to heal, and the nation needs to come together under the common sense of how we stop events like this from happening ever again.
Rabbi Jonathan Perlman was there as the shots rang out and attempted to help congregants to safety.
What happened will not break us. It will not ruin us. We will continue to thrive and sing and worship and learn together and continue our historic legacy in this city with the friendliest people that we know.
As police and SWAT teams responded, it soon became apparent that this was a hate crime. The suspected gunman, Robert Bowers, told police he wanted to kill as many Jews as possible. Armed with an assault rifle and pistols, Bowers killed 8 men and 3 women. Their ages ranged from 54 to 97, a married couple and 2 brothers among the dead.
During the course of his deadly assault on the people of the synagogue, Bowers made statements regarding genocide and his desire to kill Jewish people. After a standoff with police, Bowers eventually surrendered and remains in federal custody today. So our complaint charges Bowers with 29 separate federal crimes.
Outside the Tree of Life synagogue, people have been laying flowers for the victims all day. This is one of the oldest Jewish communities in the U.S.
There must be no tolerance for anti-Semitism in America or for any form of religious or racial hatred or prejudice.
Shortly after the shooting, President Trump calling for unity in a nation where hate crime is on the rise. But in fact, as investigators search Bowers' home for evidence, there's now renewed focus on the rhetoric the president himself uses. Bowers appears to have been triggered by a white extremist conspiracy theory about U.S. Jews funding the caravan of Central American migrants making its way through Mexico, a theme President Trump himself has alluded to. The president and his supporters, however, disavowing any linkages. Donald Trump instead musing that perhaps an armed guard may have prevented this massacre. Shihab Rattansi, Al Jazeera, Pittsburgh.
Before we go to our guest, let's remind ourselves of some of the other attacks. One woman died in Charlottesville, Virginia, when a car ploughed into a crowd during rival protests by white supremacists and anti-racists. Mosques became a target. One in Michigan was burned down, another in Arizona broken into, and a homemade bomb was detonated at an Islamic center in Minnesota. African Americans were attacked by whites. A university student in Maryland was stabbed to death, and a 66-year-old man in Baltimore was killed with a sword. Immigrants were also victims. A white man was kicked out of a bar in Kansas City after racially abusing 2 Indian men. He returned and shot them, killing one. Let's now bring in our guests. Joining us in Nutley, New Jersey, we have Stephen Rogers. He's a member of the Trump for President Advisory Board and a former member of the FBI National Joint Terrorism Task Force. In New York, Stosh Cotler, CEO of Bend the Arc, that's a Jewish action group. And in Boston, Carle, former Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats at the CIA. A warm welcome to you all. I'd like to start in New York with Stosh Cotler. You've written this open letter asking the US President Donald Trump to denounce white nationalism. You're very convinced that it's because of his rhetoric that's allowed the Pittsburgh attack to happen. Why do you think that?
I absolutely believe that this president and his administration and all of those who enable him have created an environment where so many of us are in danger. Jews are in danger, Muslim communities are in danger, Sikh communities, immigrant communities, people of color communities, trans communities, all of us have been named explicitly and implicitly in the rhetoric, in the campaign rallies that have been held. We have been made to be known to the rest of this country as dangers, as menaces, which we all know is not true. And what we also know is that when language and the vitriol and when the tone is so, when it is so elevated, we can be certain that someone will take that tone as permission to create and cause violence. What happened this weekend, and actually what happened with the murders of the 2 Black people in Kentucky this week, all of these are examples of what is inevitable when we have a president and when we have an entire Republican Party who refuses to denounce white nationalism, who refuses to renounce white supremacy, and who create the conditions where people feel like they can act without repercussions. Our communities are being terrorized, and this president needs to be held accountable.
But this is a very strong letter. Some could perhaps accuse you by saying that President Donald Trump is not welcome in Pittsburgh of amping up the rhetoric and using the same type of language as you're accusing the US president of.
Well, I would frame it differently. The letter says very clearly that Trump and members of his cabinet and this administration would, in fact, be welcome in Pittsburgh and everywhere else, with the simple request that he and all members of the Republican Party denounce white nationalism. That should be quite straightforward. White nationalists are extremists. White nationalists have been known to be called and are domestic terrorists. There's absolutely no reason why the President of the United States and the Republican Party and its members should not have the common decency and the moral compass to simply say that white nationalism is not acceptable in the United States.
Let me bring in Stephen Rogers in New Jersey here. You've heard what our guest has had to say. US President Donald Trump is responsible for the rhetoric that's fueled the kind of hatred we've seen over the weekend. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely not. Look, the President of the United States and the Republican Party and the Democrat Party and every decent living human being on this earth has denounced white nationalism, bias, and prejudice on the face of this earth. That's number one. Number two, look, I've been in law enforcement for 38 years, and I've learned one thing, that those who commit acts of violence and crime, they're the ones accountable and responsible for their actions. We have gone through decades of violence on television, violence on radio, violence in the newspapers. We've been fed in this country decades of violence from Hollywood. I mean, look, we have a culture that has been growing up for years on violence. So it is unfair and unwarranted to blame this on the rhetoric of the President of the United States. And let me add this, that the Jewish communities throughout this country do support the President. The Prime Minister of Israel supports the President. So at the end of the day, this is not to be pinned on the president and his rhetoric, or anybody else's rhetoric for that matter. The people who committed these crimes, these acts of violence, are responsible for that. But the healing, we have to begin, and I agree at this point, we have to begin to think about healing, and it's going to be, it must begin in our elementary schools. We must talk more and teach more about anti-Semitism and prejudice. We haven't been doing much of that, and we should focus our attention on that.
Like you say, you've been in law enforcement for 38 years. You are saying that there is a culture of violence in the US, but nothing happens in a vacuum. What we're asking you is the reason the Pittsburgh shooting happened is because the shooter felt enabled by a rise in white nationalism in the US because he felt that the US president, certain members of his administration, have been sympathetic or at least understanding of white nationalists, if not outwardly supporting them.
Well, look, I can't get into this individual's mind. I mean, there have been criminals who I have interviewed over the years who have said that They have certain beliefs, certain theology that they believe in. But never have I heard anyone say, well, I blame it on one particular person, one particular actress or actor or president or politician. I think that's kind of using that person, in this case, the president, as a scapegoat. Look, we have people all over this country. Look at the actors and even some of the sports figures calling out for violence. Eric Holder, Maxine Waters, calling out for people to commit violent acts against Republicans. I don't think they're responsible for some lunatic walking into a restaurant doing what they did a few weeks ago to Mitch McConnell and others. So accountability and responsibility is on the shoulders of those who committed the crimes.
Let me bring in Boston here, and Glenn, Carle, you heard there that it was an individual lunatic, to use Stephen Rogers' term there. However, how much of this has to do with being able to operate much more openly now, being able to say that I am a white nationalist and therefore these are my beliefs? Do you think things have changed for the worse in the United States of America?
Oh, I don't think so. I know so. It's not a question of my opinion or even an informal assessment. There's empirical data that demonstrates that this is the case. For years, the intelligence community has assessed formally, that includes the FBI, the CIA, all of the law enforcement, that the greatest danger to American lives and treasure in the United States comes from the far-right militia and vigilante groups. Unfortunately, or tragically, terribly, the intelligence community was not really allowed to say that clearly because, according to the Republican leadership who denied us the authorization to state that, that would then tar, quote, unfairly, the conservatives, who are the Republicans. But the data is clear. Also, just as when in sports, your body goes where you turn your head, similarly, our thoughts go where our words lead us. Words have practical, physical, material, demonstrable effect. And to allege that statements that create a false equivalence between white nationalists, let's call them what they are, racists and American fascists, with people who oppose that is either disingenuous or naive. It's a fact.
Let me bring in New York here and Stosh Cotler. You've just heard what both our guests have to say. The Anti-Defamation League are reporting that a rise in hate crimes has gone up by has gone to 57%, a big spark since the US President Donald Trump took over. What's the language that the US President uses that worries you the most before the Pittsburgh attack happened? Were you alarmed by the kind of things that he was saying?
Yes, I've been alarmed by this president from the moment he took office, and in fact, when he started his candidacy. And I just want to double down on the words of the speaker who just spoke before me. I really want to make sure that it is very clear that the Jewish community, 76% of the Jewish community did not vote for Donald Trump. 30% of the Jewish community only identify as Republicans. We are overwhelmingly a community that does not support this agenda, this administration's agenda, and the language, the rhetoric, the rallies, the incitement to mob violence, the scapegoating, this is creating a sense of permission for the individuals who do follow Trump and this administration to act brazenly and to act as if they are not going to have consequences. And because of that, I think it is imperative that all of us around the country, all of us who feel like we are in the crosshairs right now of a dangerous administration who is not interested in caring for our lives, the lives of our families or communities, in honor of those who were slain in Pittsburgh, in honor of those who are calling for Donald Trump to either renounce white nationalism and his party, the Republicans, to denounce white nationalism, or they are not welcome in Pittsburgh. I believe it's time that all of us across the country hold up that call as well, that all communities who feel like we are targets of Trump make it clear that neither he or anyone in the Republican Party is welcome in our towns, in our cities, in our states, unless they do the simple basic right thing, which is to denounce white nationalism, to make it clear that that is a party that does not want ties to these radical extremists. But really, these ideas are not only held any longer by extremists. These are ideas that have become mainstream, part of the Republican Party's platform overall, and it needs to stop.
Stephen Rogers in New Jersey, is it time for the US president to denounce white nationalism?
He has. He has denounced white nationalism, and so has the Republican Party. And let me add this. One of our guests used the word mob. Well, that word mob didn't come out of the president's mouth. That came out of the mouth of some of the Democrats. That was Maxine Waters and that was Eric Holder. They were the ones that said, let's get the mobs after the Republican leadership in the restaurants. So you see, that my point is that, look, we could point the finger in the direction of the president or in the direction of the Democrats. It's the person who commits the act of violence. Yeah, we can do better. We could work well together. But what we must do is recognize the root cause of this problem has been going on for decades and decades and decades, and we still have massive violence in Chicago, massive violence in Baltimore. That has nothing to do with the rhetoric that's going on. My point is, together, we could work very well together if we start elementary school level, start refocusing on the things that we need to focus on to stop violence. And may I add one more thing? It also begins in the home. We've got to get parents engaged with their children about all of these things that are going on. This was a tragedy. Of all tragedies I've had in my lifetime, this is the worst one. And it should be a wake-up call to everyone. But let's point in the direction that we should to start healing these wounds.
Glenn Carle in Boston. Our guest in New Jersey, Stephen Rogers, is saying that it needs to begin at home, that perhaps Hollywood is to blame for all of this, that there's a culture of violence in the US that's perhaps to blame for all of this. Is it also to do with the fact that the US has some of the most lax gun control laws in the world? Is gun control a part of this as well, the ease of availability of weapons?
Well, what we just heard are sort of the tired old shell game rationalizations when the facts are pretty clear. The statement that guns don't kill people, people kill people is part of this whole silly trope, or tragic trope. What are guns intended to do? They are designed to kill people. If people didn't have guns, would guns kill people? The answer is no. There's a clear, again, empirically demonstrable, overwhelmingly proven relationship between the availability of guns and the number of people who are killed by them. In Europe, dozens of people per year are killed by handguns in a population that's larger than the United States. In the United States, it's 12,000 per year. What is the one difference between the two civilizations or societies? It's the availability of guns. So this business that it's because of video games or violence being condoned or not taught against in the home is dissembling. It's the simple word for it is that it is a lie. Again, either it is naive because it's sincerely believed but wrong, or it is misleading. The facts are clear. Guns lead to death, and gun control will reduce it. That's just empirically demonstrated.
Stosh Cotler in New York. This was very much about racism, about anti-Semitism, but your concerns are slightly larger than that in that you feel that minority communities are being targeted under this administration. I'm going to ask you about the gun control laws. Do you think that would have helped, or do you think the hatred would simply manifest itself in a different way?
Well, I believe that we absolutely are a country that needs to have an entire transformation on how we are approaching the issues of gun violence and gun control. I absolutely agree we need to have a very different and aggressive set of reforms that, in fact, most gun owners, most members of the NRA, most folks who actually use guns for things like hunting and to provide food for their family, they too also want for there to be common sense solutions so that people aren't using guns to murder and accidentally cause deaths. I do believe as well that the slaughter of 11 people on Saturday morning during a prayer service when a baby was being named, that did happen at the hands of an individual who was wielding a gun. And I also do believe that the hatred and the bigotry and the ability to dehumanize an entire community of people, entire communities of people, mean that there will be individuals who are given a platform by our leader in this country, the President of the United States, who calls them fine people, that these individuals will find ways to harm and injure and kill others of us who this president, the Republican Party, and many others have deemed to be people who don't matter, people whose lives are not worth saving or caring about. So yes, it's true. I do very much believe that we need to have a very different set of gun reforms in this country, and there are fantastic organizations that are doing that work. I do want us to keep a focus on the fact that this violence happened because we have, as a country, created an environment where certain communities are deemed to be more disposable and dispensable than others. And for all of us who are in the crosshairs of this administration who is too cowardly in this moment to simply denounce white nationalism right now, today, let's have everyone just say white nationalism is not acceptable in the United States. We will not do business with white nationalists.
We are running out of time.
We will not
I'm going
sit
to
on boards
ask
of white nationalists.
Stephen Rogers here in New Jersey to come in there because we are running out of time and I do want to get to you all again. Stephen Rogers, there's two questions I really want to ask you here. Gun control, do you need more gun control? Would a good guy with a gun have been able to stop that attack in Pittsburgh? And secondly, why doesn't the president denounce white nationalism in clear terms in the wake of the Pittsburgh attack?
Okay, once again, I must tell you that he has denounced white nationalism, as has the Republican Party. He's done that a few times, so that's already been done. And if he needs to do it again, and I believe he does, I'm sure he's going to do it again. But with regard to gun control, yes, the prior speaker's right. There should be common sense gun regulations or some sort of guidelines that could keep guns away from mentally deranged people. But let me say this. Chicago has the toughest gun control laws in the nation, the highest murder rate by guns. Baltimore, high murder rate by guns. Washington, D.C., one of the toughest, higher murder rate by guns. The fact of the matter is, and look, I've been involved in a shooting. I've seen victims who have been on the other end of a gun barrel, and had they had a gun in their hands, maybe some of them would be alive. Responsible gun owners with guns, as we've seen this past week, by the way, will put an end to these people who are coming in and at the very least minimize more violence. If a person did have a weapon in the synagogue, well, who knows what would have happened?
I just need to bring it in. We are running out of time. We are running out of time. But let me just bring in Boston here and Glenn Carle. I saw you shaking your head at what Stephen Rogers was saying. Why are you shaking your head?
Well, this is another empirically proven mistruth, false statement. All of the data shows that the possession of guns, actually by people who think that it will lead to their help for self-defense, leads to an increased danger of them being harmed by somebody else with a gun or violence. It does not make one safer. It puts one in greater danger. That's simply empirically proven.
Thanks to all our guests, Stephen Rogers, Glenn Carle and Stosh Cotler. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.